After one episode, it's fair to say the King, Eternal Monarch is good. Really good. Although confusing to begin with as we jump between the different timelines, the King, Eternal Monarch does a wonderful job setting the scene for the season to come and doing so with enough wit, charisma and intrigue to keep you coming back for more. Whether it'll be another smash hit like Crash Landing or not remains to be seen, but there's certainly scope here for this one to challenge that illustrious 2020 title. We begin episode 1 of The King, Eternal Monarch with an intriguing story told by a man named Lee Lim, complete with blood-stained hands and handcuffs in the police station. Only, his police file reads that he's 70, but yet, he doesn't look a day over 25. The reason for his happens to stem from a rivalry involving his brother and obtaining the Manpasikjiok, a fabled flute of old that allows one to transport between worlds. We then cut across to the Kingdom of Korea, in winter 1994. A group of armed guards, led by Lee Rim, show up and confront his father. Lee Rim stabs King Lee Ho in the heart and takes the Four Tigers sword for his own. Only, a young Lee Gon turns up and demands Lee Rim be imprisoned and given the maximum sentence. Soldiers surround him, and it leads Lee Rim to stab the boy in the throat against a pillar. Suddenly, a strange man arrives, leading to a big shootout. Lee Rim bemoans the lack of time left and hurries out the palace, leaving behind the shattered glass and 2 bodies. In the morning, word gets out about the murder, and Lee Gon is crowned king. Prince Baiyong arrives to oversee affairs and the subsequent manhunt for Lee Rim. Only, our antagonist makes his way into the forest with the shattered remnants of the flute, which conjures up a portal to a parallel world. That world takes him to the Republic of Korea in 1994, a world that's far different from his own, and much more like the Korea of today. Instead of the current royal appointment is a president. In this reality, Lee Rim is disabled and confined to a wheelchair, while Lee Ho is a beggar in the streets. Killing his alternate self, Lee Rim watches as this reality's Lee Gon arrives and sees firsthand what's happened. Sensing this could be bad news, Korea's Lee Gon is killed. In the Kingdom of Korea, the new king is crowned as our wounded Lee Gon steps up and mourns his father. As he weeps in the palace, he meets Jo Yeong and hands him the unbreakable sword, a token to help him feel better and forge their friendship together. In the Republic meanwhile, Lee Rim's body, the one from that world, is shown to his wife, and she confirms his identity. Back home she thanks the heavens for his death, given how much of a burden he was to her. Only, listening from the other room is the impostor Lee Rim, who stands up from the wheelchair and towers over her as she cowers in the corner. Lee Rim's body washes up on shore in Korea, and with it, a declaration of his death and confirmation that every bone in his body has been broken. As we then skip forward to the fall of 2019, Lee Rim returns after an extended absence and hasn't aged a day. King Lee Gon, however, certainly has. He has no interest in getting married and instead busies himself with his duties as king. At the rowing boat competition, someone shoots at Lee Gon, prompting his head of security, Jo Young, to protect him. Holding 2 suspects up at gunpoint, Lee Gon spies a man dressed in a black rabbit suit behind them, and is immediately reminded of his favorite fairy tale Alice in Wonderland. After chasing him through the streets, the rabbit manages to get away, but it doesn't stop Lee Gon from being weighed down by the issues that have haunted him all these years, a lot of which stemming from the traumatic moments involving his father. Back in the Republic of Korea, Tae-yul works with the police to root out a criminal at his house, but doing so in a pretty brash way. However, this does bring with it its own rewards, as she uncovers a murder scene in the parking lot. Underhanded and with little manpower in the force, Tae-yul and the others refuse to do overtime to handle this new. Lee Gon meanwhile, finds the rabbit again and grabs his horse Maximus, charging through the forest to try and catch him. He doesn't find the rabbit, but does happen to stumble upon the portal to the parallel world. Racing forward, he's transported into Korea where Tae-yul asks him to park his horse by the side of the road. He doesn't listen though and instead, looks around this new world some more. Tae-yul confronts him face to face and, realizing he knows her face, hugs her tightly as he whispers that he's found her. This is where episode 1 comes to a close. The King, Eternal Monarch sets the scene beautifully in its first episode. With lots of nods to Alice in Wonderland, the White Rabbit, the actual book and the Looking Glass being the more obvious ones, plus plenty of glimpses for how this one is likely to play out going forward. The King, Eternal Monarch does a wonderful job setting the foundations for what's almost certainly going to be a really dramatic season ahead. Given this is Lee Min-ho's first drama after returning from military service, he slots into the role of Lee Gon perfectly, and his counterpart, Lee Rim, is certainly shaping up to be a formidable opponent going forward. At a guess, I'd imagine the cloaked figure we saw during the early parts of the episode is Lee Rim himself, possibly finding a way to travel through time as well as parallel dimensions, and causing a time paradox to occur where this always happens on a loop. Of course, take this theory with a pinch of salt, but it's not all serious doom and gloom here either. There's some wonderful bits of humor injected into this one, and the music really helps heighten the tension too. Quite what tomorrow's episode has in store for us remains to be seen, but based on what we've seen here, if it's even half as good as this premiere, then we're in for one heck of a treat. After yesterday's exciting opening chapter, The King, Eternal Monarch slows down this time around, adding extra comedy and romance into the fold, while allowing the characters to grow into their roles. With less time jumping and a lot more back and forth between Taeyul and Lee Gon, this Korean drama slows its pace down in favor of adding extra depth to proceedings. Episode 2 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Taeyul questioning Lee Gon over his greeting and requesting his ID card. Instead, he tells her he's the king of Korea and admits that he believes he's come from a parallel universe. He asks to see Queen Yor, but instead, she arrests him and brings Maximus to the outside of the station, where the other officers marvel at his beauty. When Taeyul searches through his belongings, she finds a lot of material related to the Kingdom of Korea that causes her to seize it for investigation. After taking his fingerprints, Lee Gon curses his luck as he's put behind bars. However, Jo Young happens to be working in the station there, and Lee Gon watches in surprise, as he realizes this isn't the same Young that he knows, backing up his theory of this being a parallel universe. The fingerprint results come back, and Taeyul learns that no one in the database matches the prints. Deciding to go one step further, she instead takes a swab from inside his mouth. Lee Gon is smart though, realizing that there's no record of him in the files here, and goes on to talk to her again about the parallel worlds. Trying in vain to distract her with his dashing looks, Taeyul eventually realizes this line of questioning is futile, and she releases him, joining Lee Gon as he heads to the jeweler's and sells one of his diamonds. It's worth a lot too, and as the night draws on, he decides to get a hotel room while Taeyul gets back to work. Back in Korea, Nam worries for Lee Gon as Captain Jo searches for clues over where the king may have gone. With CCTVs not helping and Lee Gon's footprint stopping in the middle of the forest, Jo contemplates just what this means. Captain Jo remembers what Lee Gon told him about the rabbit and watch, deciding to start using this as a clue to fuel his investigation. He speaks to Sung-ae and tries to piece together the fragments of what's going on, before presenting this back to Nam. In the Republic, Lee Gon settles into his hotel while Taeyul gets to work, bombarded with messages from Lee Gon surrounding this new world. When he finally subsides, retreating to the library to read up on what's happened in this timeline's Korea, Taeyul meets him, and the two discuss the differences over a plate of chicken that Lee Gon is not used to trying. After a brief flashback involving the flute, Lee Gon pushes Taeyul to admit the reasons she's helping him, given how vehemently she refuses to believe in his story. Meanwhile, we cut back and see the moments that took place with Song Yung-hae, after Lia Lim killed her son Jae-han on the back of her laughter. Following this segment, we see a more somber, poignant Yung-hae haunted by the ghosts of the past. Taeyul meanwhile contemplates Lee Gon's final words surrounding a reason for him being in this world, and it's enough to pique her interest and head back to see him. The ID card that Lee Gon has, the one he acquired 25 years ago, was issued to her on the 11th November 2019. He's waiting around until that time to figure out what significance, if any, this may have. While he waits, Lee Gon makes a big decision and decides to make Taeyun his queen and wife. As she looks at him, she shakes her head and mutters how crazy he is as he stares deeply into her eyes, where the episode ends. With plenty of character development and some nice back and forth between the two leads, The King Eternal Monarch takes the time to build up the budding romance between our two main characters. It works well for the most part too, with plenty of funny jokes and memorable moments dotted throughout. Although this humor is welcome and there's a few nicely shot segments of dialogue, there isn't an awful lot of plot development this time around. One little Easter egg worth mentioning though comes from the Republic of Korea's Captain Jo turning on the TV and cheekily watching Busted after the familiar Netflix logo ping. It's a small moment, but it's enough to really set this in real time and offer K-drama fans a bit of an Easter egg. As the King, Eternal Monarch starts to slow down and settle into a more consistent rhythm. It'll be interesting to see what direction this takes next, but given the preview we received for next week's episode, it seems likely now that time travel may actually be a contributing factor here. Following on from the previous episode, the King Eternal Monarch continues to deliver its story with a slow pace, but manages to inject some intriguing new elements of sci-fi into the fold that leaves things wide open going forward. Between the ideas of time travel and the intertwined fates of Leolim and Ligon, the King, Eternal Monarch ends things on an open-ended note ready for tomorrow's episode. Episode 3 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Taeyul texting Shinjae and cancelling her plans with him, instead meeting Ligon, where we see him proposing to her and offering his heart. She rejects him of course, but instead challenges him to take her to the parallel universe. Only, because he doesn't have the flute, then the portal fails to open. After talking about fate and family, Taeyul and Ligon head back, while Shinjae sees Maximus and the royal seal. In the Kingdom of Korea, Nam hires a new writer for the court while looking over the speculative rumors being spread about Ligon's disappearance. At the same time, Prime Minister Koo prepares for her board meeting surrounding salaries. Her ideas don't go down well with the board, who berate her as Mr. Park accuses her of putting on more makeup. Koo bites back though, telling them they should be looking out for the citizens and improving their party image. Back at the palace, Nam tasks Jo Young to investigate Taeyul. As he steps into Ligon's study, we jump back in time and see Jo Young discuss Leelim's body. Leelim however continues to walk through the Kingdom of Korea, straight into Yosu bookstore, where he finds a note labeled "The King left the palace" inside a book. Back in the Republic, a new recruit arrives at the station called Jang Michael. This keen rookie tells them to call him Jangmi. He's eccentric and a little off the wall, but the group take him along to their next stop on their murder investigation, which includes a junkyard and finding a crowbar used as a weapon. After finding it and handing it over to forensics, Taeyul decides to put Jang Mi to work on boring paperwork before Ligon hangs out with Yoon Seop and manages to get Taeyul's desk phone. However, it turns out Shinjae is working with some pretty shady gangsters, and as they hand him a bag full of money, he tells them to make sure they'll be there for the next crackdown, so he can get his promotion. Taeyul continues to investigate Ligon's appearance, and between the horse and no records of him existing in this world, she instead sits down to drink soju with him and work out just who he is. As they talk, he mentions the changing monarchy in 1945 and the deviations his world took in the wake of moving the office to Busan. Taeyul scoffs at the notion though, telling him he's a good novelist. The next day, Taeyul's car breaks down, but as she phones the dojo, Ligon picks the phone up instead and races off to help her. Only, when he arrives, time freezes completely, which allows him to properly look at Taeyul as she fixes her hair. Suddenly, time restarts just like before, but no one else seems to have noticed other than him. With the flute in hand, Ligon heads straight into the forest, where the portal materializes again for him. Given Leolim holds the other half of the flute, Ligon realizes that both of them can now move through the different worlds. Thanks to the big scoop of Jang Mi finding the bloodied crowbar in the junkyard, the Kim Bok-man case can now be put to bed. Only, Taeyul isn't so sure it's that black and white. She takes Shinjae with him into an alleyway, where Taeyul's investigation takes a turn for the worst when a group of thugs arrive and start fighting them. Thankfully, Ligon shows up and gets involved, managing to fight them all off. In the aftermath of this, Ligon bids farewell to Taeyul and informs her he's going back to his world, given he's left the palace empty for too long. As he grabs Maximus, Shinjae tells Ligon he's seen the crest before, but Ligon reminds him that's not possible, especially given it's from. After stopping at the bookstore and reading a poem, Ligon summons the portal and rides through alone with Maximus, back to Korea, while Taeyul remains alone in the Republic, where the episode ends. Although there isn't a lot of plot development this episode, there are some solid foundations set going forward. With Ligon now aware of what's happening, and the faint notion of time travel being involved too, it raises an interesting question around just who the figure was at the start of the first episode. This episode seems to point at it being Ligon, but whether that's true or not remains to be seen. Visually, the show looks fantastic, and there's no denying that Eternal Monarch has a lot of great cinematography, along with playing off the usual humorous tics to keep things engaging, while the characters are built up. Hopefully tomorrow's episode starts to crank up the tension, though as right now this story does feel quite slow and lethargic. The King, Eternal Monarch bows out with another pretty good episode, but it still feels like a long way off reaching the same quality as that excellent opener. After yesterday's slow character builder, The King, Eternal Monarch returns today for a much more plot-heavy episode, one that starts to piece together what's happening while leaving plenty of tantalizing questions hanging over this one. The ending will almost certainly keep you sticking around for the next episode, and there's a lot of teasing hints dotted throughout that feel like they'll hold up to repeat viewings when the full season is out. Episode 4 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins in the Kingdom of Korea as Lelim experiences the time freezes firsthand. Thanks to him holding part of the flute, he's immune to its effects. Even more peculiar than that, however, occurs when time unfreezes. Jo Young and Yoon Suk both experience their cup being hot at the same time in the parallel worlds. Prime Minister Koo arrives at the palace to check on Lee Gon and makes sure he's not missing. She bursts into the room and sees him standing with Jo Young, who found him earlier in the words. They discuss his puzzle and she smirks, telling him he's indebted to her now before walking away. After OK Nam berates Lee Gon for leaving, she tends to his jacket and notices the BBQ chicken coupon and the book of poetry, labeled Poems of Kim So-wol, in the pocket. Prime Minister Koo watches secret footage of Congressman Park bad-mouthing her, and sets to work making him pay for it. She sends incriminating photos of him involved in a scandalous affair to the media, and as the news spreads, she begins to tighten her grip over the administration. Lee Lim starts to figure out that his nephew can jump through time, while Lee Gon himself faces the past, and looks upon the place his father was killed, in particular the sword that lies there. Heading back to the palace, time stops again, but this time Lee Gon counts the seconds to try and work out if there's some sort of pattern. As it starts to rain and lightning crackles across the sky, Lee Gon once again starts to feel pain in his shoulder back at the palace. Jo Young watches his veins crackle orange just as this happens, and as the head of security dashes out the room, Lee Gon takes his opportunity to snatch up the flute and leave. In the Republic of Korea, Tae-yul refuses to let the Sang-mi murder trial go and tells the captain she's going to crack his 2G phone, which will take 2 weeks. The captain agrees to let her pursue this, but warns her that, if she hasn't found anything in that time, then she and Shin Jae will be out. Thankfully, she manages to track down Olet and arrests Kim Soo-jin after finding a red wallet up for sale online. Shin Jae confronts his mother when she returns home and finds a whole stack of cash hidden up her skirt. Realizing she clearly stole this through illegal gambling, Shin Jae forces her to bring the bag back to its origin, with Jang Mi joining him, in order to snap photos of the operation. When the boss arrives, Shin Jae realizes this could cause some serious ramifications for him, but he follows through with the arrest. Meanwhile, a little boy on a bike knocks Tae-yul's ID out of her hands, and it falls down the drain. Realizing this may fit with the prophetic narrative, this is reinforced further in the form of the Korean notes, which she learns are actually real and watermarked. Tae-yul heads back into the station and realizes the dates for her replacement card coincides with what she's been told by Lee Gon. As she sits in stunned silence, she receives a call from Lee Gon himself and she immediately races off, where she finds herself face to face with the king. She questions him about the ID card, and he tells her exactly what she was wearing the day of the photo. He takes her hand and convinces her to come with him so she can see the card for herself. Riding on Maximus, they make their way into the forest, and he races through the portal to the other side, to Korea. With a drip feed of information this episode, and lots of hints of what may be going on, it appears the time jumps are linked with Lee Gon and Lee Lim jumping through the portal. Could it be that the time freezes are linked to the moment they jump to the other side? It certainly looks that way, but it doesn't explain what happened to Jo Young and Yoon Seop and their inexplicably linked senses. Could the realities be breaking down thanks to these constant jumps? The inevitable romance between Tae-yul and Lee Gon is starting to actually take shape now, and with Tae-yul in Korea, and seeing the king in his natural surroundings, what will this mean for our steely detective? There's lots of unanswered questions hanging over this one, but right now the show is certainly building up a nice layer of questions for the season ahead. Quite where this one goes next, though, remains to be. The King, Eternal Monarch has, so far at least, struggled to hit those same heights the opening chapter achieved so effortlessly. There's certainly a lot to like about this, though in the slow burn mystery and teasing glimpses of sci-fi elements certainly piques enough interest to stick around with this one. Having said that though, this episode essentially works to deepen Tae-yul's character, and begins to drip-feed information at Lee Lim's plan, leaving enough open for tomorrow's episode following the cliffhanger ending. Episode 5 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins in the Republic of Korea with Shin Jae learning that Maximus and Lee Gon have now gone. After this brief introduction, we cut across to Korea, where Jo Young rings through to OK Nam and tells her that Lee Gon has returned. As she looks at the four-tiger sword, Lee Gon welcomes Tae-yul to his world. He also shows her a strange gateway where time passes differently. For now though, this remains a mystery, as Lee Gon takes her back to the palace. On the way, an altercation outside involving Jo Young sees him recognize her as Taeyul, and they take her across the water to the palace. While the king attends his duties, Taeyul is tended to by Narai. Only, in this universe she's known as Myung Sing-ae. Although she still has the same straightforward mannerisms, Taeyul finds herself in over her head, and tries to learn more about this world, calling herself an illegal migrant. Jo Young arrives soon after and requests her thumbprint. He outright asks just who she is, and questions whether she's the one who caused the scars on Lee Gon's shoulder to materialize. This is the first time Taeyul has heard about this, of course, and she looks surprised when he asks. Leaving the room, Lee Gon coolly arrives with a plate full of food and dismisses his advisors. She demands he try the food first given she's like Alice in Wonderland, but when he refuses, she wolfs it down until OK Nam arrives and escorts her to her room. When that's the furthest away from Lee Gon's, of course. Given strict instructions by OK Nam, Taeyul tries to settle in, but struggles to acclimatize to this strange new world. The king figures out what room she's in, and he settles in with her, sitting against the bed and talking about this world. When the conversation turns to dating, Lee Gon kisses her tenderly, but she simply stares at him, unmoving. In the morning, the king heads back to her room, and suggests they leave without the court lady knowing. Only OK Nam happens to be in the room, and she berates him for his naivety. Armed with a disguise for her to wear, the king does his rounds, hitting a basketball in the hoop, and discussing math to a room full of eager listeners. The king is forced to head off alone without his security detail though, straight to a crash site, while Leolin meets with the poor woman, and tells her she needs to kill her own self in Korea, to take a better life for herself. That poor woman presumably has familial ties to Congressman Park in Korea, with the implication he's planting decoys there, but for now this is very much in the realm of guesswork and speculation. Taeyul continues to explore Korea, heading to the police station, and exploring her old hangout spots. The king eventually calls Jo Young to go and gather her, bringing Taeyul to him. It turns out Taeyul was looking for her mum all this time, but before she can elaborate further, Prime Minister Koo arrives with news. As she greets them both, she outstretches her hand and introduces herself to Taeyul. While Leolim's motive is certainly intriguing, his frustratingly limited amount of time on screen right now is a bit of a shame. His character is severely underutilized here, and while the romance between Taeyul and Lee Gon is given time to grow and manifest in a pretty organic way, as a sci-fi drama this one feels a little too slow. Exploring Korea is such a trip, though, and seeing the subtle changes in Korea is one of the standouts of this episode, doing well to keep things engaging, while the actual plot line starts to grow a bit lethargic. With plenty of promise and the foundation set here for a dramatic second half to follow, let's hope tomorrow's episode picks up the pace. One of the biggest problems facing the King, Eternal Monarch right now is its pacing. The first 5 episodes have so far delivered some pretty good characterization, but at the expense of a story that hasn't really advanced all that much. With the halfway point of this Korean drama approaching, Eternal Monarch finally starts to step it up a gear, with some solid foundations for next week in the tense, albeit anticlimactic, showdown in Korea with rival military forces. Episode 6 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Prime Minister Koo introducing herself to Taeyul. She dances around telling her name, though, and instead calls herself a traveler. As Lee Gon takes his leave with her, Koo remains suspicious. On his private jet, Lee Gon and Taeyul exchange words via their hands as Secretary Mo's wide-eyed stare shows how scandalous this act is in Korea. When they land, Lee Gon cooks for Taeyul and they discuss his past involving Leolim and the scar inflicted by him on his neck, a constant reminder of his hell. As they sit down to eat, Lee Gon hands over Taeyul's ID card he's kept all this time. A suspicious Captain Jo hands over the glass and fingerprint to one of his advisors, intending to check Taeyul on the system for matches. Before they can proceed, however, both men receive a message from Koo to attend an urgent meeting by the NSC. The Japanese Navy make a strategic military move and enter territorial waters. Given this is the 3rd time they've done this, and Koo has talked them down twice, they learn that this may not work out as effectively a 3rd time. Koo summons the troops to mobilize and prepare for action, while the Japanese ships sail toward Korean shores. Back in the Republic of Korea, Sin-jae has flashbacks to the past, where he was beaten down by 6 boys before Taeyul phoned the police and helped her. Exuding confidence, she beats one of the boys down with one kick, and proceeds to help Sin-jae, encouraging him to take up Taekwondo and learn to stick up for himself. As Li Gan prepares for the fight ahead, dressed in naval gear, Taeyul promises to wait for him as she heads back to the Republic and slots back into her role as a police investigator. Later Taeyul flashes back to her time during the World Between Worlds, where she presents her pack of imaginary flowers and tries to make them grow. In Korea, Li Gan makes a strategic move and presses ahead with surrounding the Japanese vessel. The king's flag is raised and with it, acknowledgement that the king himself is on the ship. He fires a warning shot at the Aegis, and for now at least, things remain stabilized. The conflict, however, feels like it's far from over. Back at the palace, Jo Young learns there's no match for Taeyul on the system, and sets to work on the next stage of his plan. He searches through the CCTV footage, and finds a match with Taeyul. He remains quiet in the presence of Li Gan though. He's called away by Prince Baiyong, who presents him with the death certificate of the man that's supposed to be Li Lim, only it clearly isn't Li Lim, and the prince has been lying all this time. Li Gan realizes that his rival is still alive. Li Lim shows up in Korea and orders coffee, which is given to him by none other than Narai. He tells her a typhoon is coming, and as he leaves, lightning crackles across the sky, prompting his neck to spark with the same strange glow as Li Gan's has in the past. Realizing that Li Lim is going to be coming for the other half of the flute, Li Gan jumps across to Korea again, and stands waiting for Taeyul as she arrives at the Taekwondo center. She rushes toward him, and throws her arms around him, thankful that she's safe as the episode. While the conflict with Japan and Korea adds a nice injection of pace for this K-drama, the resolution does feel a bit anticlimactic. However, this does help to set the foundation for a possible war on the horizon, which I'd imagine will be used to push Ku into the forefront of the conflict and take the reins in the wake of Li Gan's absence. Considering her popularity and disdain for Li Gan are both growing given his affection for Taeyul, this could lead Korea into a war with Japan. At the same time, we've got Li Lim starting to plant his seeds by potentially switching characters between the two worlds and setting into motion his plan to get the flute from Li Gan. There's certainly a lot of moving pieces here, and so far the drama hasn't really moved them around in any significant way. Having said that, this does feel like the calm before the storm, and potentially one of those dramas that suddenly explodes into action after so much characterization early on. Li Gan and Taeyul are both starting to slot into their romanticized characters pretty well now, and with lots of unanswered questions and an exciting preview of episode 7, The King, Eternal Monarch has all the ingredients to make for a thrilling second half of the season. Whether it can cook this up into a satisfying dish of spicy kimchi, however, remains to be seen. The King, Eternal Monarch returns this week and brings with it a lot more clues around where this story is going. With some big reveals throughout and plenty of material to digest before tomorrow's follow-up slice of sci-fi, Eternal Monarch is shaping up to be a fascinating series indeed, cranking up the tension after a few slower-paced episodes. Episode 7 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins in Korea as Ok-nam and the prince contemplate their dark past, and making the choice to tell Li Gan the truth about what happened surrounding Li Lim. It's here he admits to Ok-nam that Li Lim is still alive. China's foreign minister arrives and he sits with Li Gan, where they discuss the future prosperity of both countries. Li Gan is presented with the gift of his people being allowed to travel freely into China, and he expresses gratitude in the wake of this powerful leader. After exchanging pleasantries, Li Gan rides into the forest but is stopped by Jo Young standing at the gateway. He goes on to admit what he's found out about Luna, and how he believes Taeyul has been deceiving him all this time, an impostor inside the palace walls. In order to prove there are two doppelgangers, Li Gan takes Jo Young with him through the portal to Korea. As Li Lim continues to scheme, he feels time stop again, and senses that Li Gan has left the palace. As he contemplates just why he keeps leaving, Li Lim makes his move involving Chairman Park Sun-byong-yu killing his own doppelganger, and taking the position of CEO in Korea. Prime Minister Koo meanwhile, looks in the TV monitor as this happens, and appears to see a glimmer of someone staring off into the distance. Is this her in the other world? In the Republic of Korea, Taeyul and Shin-jae receive a call about a murder and race there together, where they learn a 26-year-old female has died. Given the piercings in the neck, they assume that the killer was a close accomplice. Determined to track her partner, Park In-gu, to their dismay, they realize they have to wait 3 weeks for the autopsy results to come back. In the meantime, Taeyul and Shin-jae are tasked with a stakeout before her shift ends, and she heads to Narai's coffee shop to discuss the prospect of another world being out there. It's here Narai tells her matter-of-factly that the role of doppelgangers causes chaos in the world, and as such, one of them will need to die to balance the universe out. This also leads to the situation about the worlds too, with either one or the other potentially surviving. This could be foreshadowing for what's to come as Lee Lim's plan starts to become clear. Lee Gon returns to Korea once more and presents Jo Young to Taeyul. Despite his insistence that they're safe, Yoon Seop shows up and sees himself, leading to a hilarious turn of events. The most alarming part for Yoon Seop though is that he didn't realize how handsome he actually is. As the two versions continue talking, they lay out some ground rules before Jo Young and Yoon Seop talk about their differences between the worlds. While they do, Taeyul heads out with Lee Gon, who hands him a phone with useful numbers on before ordering chicken. Unfortunately, their happiness is short-lived when Taeyul tells him news from Lee Gon's world surrounding K Stadium being built. This isn't supposed to happen and clearly hints at it being Lee Lim's meddling, given he's been switching key players between worlds, gravitating around this company. Taeyul and Lee Gon agree to join forces, and he hands over the autopsy death report for Lee Lim, along with his picture and fingerprint records. Knowing that he may well be the one behind everything, they decide to work on learning exactly what he's been doing for the last 24 years. Lee Gon experiences time stopping again, quickly stuffing a note in Jo Young's pocket to prove this is. When time unfreezes, Lee Gon now realizes what he needs to do, and teams up with Jo Young to try and trap Lee Lim and work out which world he's jumped to. Meanwhile in Korea, Prime Minister Koo learns the identity of Taeyul and sees the images of Luna in prison. Given she's been released quite recently, we cut across to Taeyul who realizes that someone has her face in Korea. As the episode draws to a close, Luna is released from prison and finds herself face to face with Prime Minister Koo, who obviously recognizes her face. It's all starting to become clear now. Lee Lim is using doppelgangers to collide both worlds and cause pure chaos. He wants both sides of the flute too, and is potentially trying to flush Lee Gon out of hiding to complete his unfinished business, given he wasn't able to kill him all those years ago. The CEO and various different figureheads in power are being used to push Lee Lim's agenda too, which may involve blurring both worlds together. Now Rai's conversation with Taeyul feels like a significant one when it comes to this, and the clever bit of foreshadowing could be giving us a taster of what we're likely to experience going forward. No doubt, Luna is going to be approached by Lee Lim, who may well tell her to assassinate Taeyul and take her place in Korea. Still, the growing romance between Taeyul and Lee Gon is good, and this, combined with the increased emphasis on the main plotline, makes this a really solid episode and one that's certainly establishing this as one of the better Korean dramas of the year. The King. Eternal Monarch returns with a revealing episode as the two worlds start to merge together and the dividing lines blur. At the center of this are Lee Gon and Lee Lim, who both have seemingly been the catalyst for the issues that are affecting both realities. With some big reveals and some insight into exactly what will happen for the rest of the series, Eternal Monarch is gearing up for a pretty dramatic second half to this Korean drama. Episode 8 of The King. Eternal Monarch begins with Lee Lim making his move and deciding to track down Taeyul. As he discusses how Lee Gon was the one who made the first move, in Korea Prime Minister Koo finds herself face to face with Luna, who tells her she's never met before. After talking, Koo realizes that Luna and Taeyul are different people, but suspects they may be twin sisters. Luna continues on and meets one of her old contacts, demanding her money back and threatening him. At the same time, the pregnant woman Lee Lim met a few episodes ago starts getting ready, while Lee Lim himself meets Koo's mother. In the Republic of Korea, Shin Jae gets the test results back from the autopsy. Together with Taeyul, they contemplate whether Jang Jae may be the one responsible. Meanwhile, Lee Gon heads off with Jo Young to a restaurant, but find themselves blindsided by a group of thugs. Only, Mun-sik shows up, and it forces Young to improvise and pretend to be Yoon Seop. When he calls the king a fool, however, Jo Young is hilariously forced to have a mole on his face. Later that day he runs into Narai, who ends up wiping the mole off. When he heads back to see Yoon Seop, they discuss Narai's proposition for later that day. While they do, Shin Jae takes his mother out for food, and they have a really touching conversation about their circumstances. It's a really raw and poignant moment, but also one that seems to hint at one big plot point: the pregnant woman Lee Lim met in Korea may well be Shin Jae's mother. Continuing her stakeout, Taeyul and Jang Mi catch Park Young-gu, but in a surprising turn of events, Yoon Jae decides to turn herself in. At the station she confesses to the murder and allows herself to be taken away in handcuffs. Outside, Taeyul says goodbye to Young-gu, but he mentions how Young Jae had two phones, and it prompts her to immediately head back to the apartment where she finds the phone charger, meaning the phone itself must be around somewhere. Lee Gon and Jo Young head to the restaurant, but the waiter appears to recognize them both, ringing alarm bells for the king. That evening, Jo Young captures him and hands his phone over to Lee Gon. It turns out this man was one of those guards in the throne room all those years ago when Lee Gon's father was killed. That night, Yoon Jae is visited by a man asking about the second phone. Yoonmi overheard a phone conversation with her, and that's why she killed him. He tells her to bring the phone to him or there will be consequences. Shin Jae heads back to the police station and speaks to Yoon Seop, demanding he hand over his phone, which actually happens to be Jo Young's. He sees the photo of Jo Young and Lee Gon together and demands to know exactly what's going on. He heads to Jo Young's hotel room in the middle of the night and sees the Korean crest and documents in his coat pocket, bringing back memories from the past. Suddenly, Jo Young arrives as Lee Gon bursts into the room too, and the truth is finally revealed to him. It turns out Shin Jae is actually from Korea, but quite how he ended up in this world remains to be seen. With a big cliffhanger ending and plenty of unanswered questions, one thing's for sure: these two worlds are starting to collide, and the once stable parallel worlds are starting to become unbalanced. Shin Jae actually being from Korea is a nice touch and certainly an unexpected turn of events, but also one that explains why he's been drawing the crest all this time. Lee Gon and Taeyul are starting to get closer now, and their romance is really well written. Their progression over the episodes has been enjoyable to watch, but I can't help but feel that Luna is the real wild card here, and her inclusion in the story certainly spells some trouble for Taeyul and Lee Gon going forward. The story is really starting to heat up now, and the second half of this sci-fi K-drama is a very tantalizing prospect. Last week's episode looked like it was starting to turn up the heat, and boy does the king, Eternal Monarch, bring it. With more depth to Lee Lim's plan, and both worlds starting to bleed together faster now, this wildly popular sci-fi series is just starting to settle into its role now with a lot of promise going forward. There's still humor here, though in the form of Jo Young and Yoon Sup switch between worlds, and the cliffhanger ending will almost certainly have you scrambling to watch the next episode, as soon as it's released. Episode 9 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Taeyul and Lee Gon discussing the details about Young and Yoon Sup from the last episode, before turning the attention on how Lee Gon and Lee Lim jump between worlds. Soon after they head back to Seoul and Lee Gon sits and eats with Yoon Sup, calling him his unbreakable sword and pitching the idea of him switching roles with Jo Young. In Korea, Shin Jae remembers the moments he was left as a child by his mother. She told him to wait by a TV store, and as he looked at a TV, he saw the king wailing. This catches us up with the previous episode, where Lee Gon informs Shin Jae that he's actually from Korea, and he's his king. Shin Jae predictably scoffs at the suggestion to follow him into Korea and walks away. As we cut back in time once more, we see Lee Lim promise to find his mother outside the store. In further flashbacks we see Lee Gon reciting the words inside the throne room as a child, and discussing the sword as well as what it means. As they do, we cut back to the present as Lee Gon receives a call from Lee Lim on the phone he snatched from the soldier last episode. Realizing that Lee Lim is actually in Korea, they both hang up the phone at the same time as the chase appears to be on. In Korea, Koo speaks to her mother about Lee Lim visiting her last episode. Koo, however, tells her to stop spreading rumors, and brushes it off as paranoia given the man is actually dead according to official records. Outside the room though, she looks over the newspaper she was sent from before, and looks again at the picture of her from the baseball game. In the aftermath of this, she speaks to the prince who fills her in on the upcoming events, including an interview with the Koo group. Specifically her husband, who happens to be in prison. She visits him, and mentions her plan to become queen by marrying Lee Gon. She then tasks her ex-husband with finding the traitors from all those years ago and walks away. Meanwhile, Taeyul presents the information about Lee Sang-do to Lee Gon, and asks the king if he's seen him. It turns out Sang-do is in Korea, prompting Lee Gon to decide on returning to his world. Reassuring Taeyul he'll be back soon, he heads off to guard the gateway between worlds. Jo Young and Yoon Sup prepare for what comes next, and they switch roles, with Yoon Sup reluctant to cut his hair. Not long after, Lee Gon returns to Korea with Lee Lim's captive soldier from the previous episode, demanding he be locked up. As he's taken away, Yoon Sup starts to settle into his role. Lee Gon places his stable hand under house arrest too, and proceeds to try and hack into Jo Young's laptop to check the security levels. However, Koo arrives and discusses the year-end report, putting an end to his laptop hacking. As they sit and discuss the report, tensions are high as Koo and Lee Gon discuss marriage briefly. Afterward, hilarity ensues as Yoon Sup starts playing around with the skincare mask we've seen Koo wearing previously. Incredibly, he then manages to hack into Jo Young's laptop on the first try. Within the laptop happens to be a group of surveillance videos saved from different dates. After seeing a whole slew of them depicting Taeyul, one of these happens to have a young Shinjae with his yo-yo, and as he looks up at the camera, Lee Gon feels the familiar burst of pain in his shoulder. Only, this video is from the bookstore in 2020. Back in Korea, Jo Young is in a tough state trying to adjust to life outside the palace and the king's service. Having given 21 days vacation notice to the police station, he drowns his sorrow in alcohol. Lee Lim also learns that Taeyul is the one who arrested Yeonjae and decides that she needs to be taken care of. He also decides to jump through the portal again, but Lee Gon is wise to what's going on, realizing that if time stops again, Lee Lim will have jumped through to Korea. Lo and behold, on New Year 2020 Lee Lim jumps through the portal, and as snow begins to fall, Lee Gon arrives in the town square riding Maximus, and finds himself face to face with his enemy. As they stare one another down, Lee Gon realizes that his foe has been manipulating time, and his goal is to try and gain eternal life, which is where the episode ends. With a big cliffhanger ending, the king, Eternal Monarch leaves things wide open for today's episode. It seems clear now that Lee Lim has been using the void between worlds to manipulate time, but just how he's been able to go and forth to different time periods remains a mystery. One thing's for sure though, Lee Lim's desire for eternal life is going to unravel both worlds and cause chaos to descend across Korea and Korea. The ending certainly leaves things wide open as well, and quite what will happen next remains to be seen. Eternal Monarch is shaping up for an exciting run of episodes to follow, and with both worlds in serious peril, it's up to Lee Gon and Taeyul to stop Lee Lim before it's too late. Following yesterday's dramatic cliffhanger, the king, Eternal Monarch returns in a big way with an action-packed 70 minutes that help to flesh out more of this world and give some crucial screen time to Lee Lim himself. Lee Jin plays this cold and calculated man to perfection, and he steals every scene he's in. As we start to approach the business end of this drama now, Eternal Monarch is really starting to come into its own, and this world-hopping drama ends on quite the dramatic note, along with hints that time travel is starting to come into this now, as predicted weeks ago when time froze. Episode 10 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins in Korea as Shin-jae talks to a therapist about his situation. As he does, we cut back to see Taeyul and Shin-jae together eating at a food stall and talking about Korea. She discusses Sang-do still being alive and the doppelgangers. As they continue to eat, she eventually asks him for help, but he walks away, refusing to entertain the notion of there being a second world. Instead, Taeyul walks to the portal and greets Lee Gon as he heads back through from the other side. As he does, she sees the balloon fly away, symbolic to what happens later on, which we'll discuss at the end, and throws her arms around him, embracing Lee Gon tightly. With Lunar New Year on the way, Taeyul speaks to Jo Young about his situation, explaining how Yoon Sup is also probably having a tough time. Back home, his siblings raise suspicions around how cool Yoon Sup suddenly is, and as they leave, he comments on how inquisitive they are. In Korea, Lee Gon returns in time for the Lunar New Year celebrations, quizzing the staff over what day it is, and wishes everyone a happy new year. With a year left of Ku's term, she works hard to try and win over Lee Gon by asking OK Nam how she can woo him. She remains tight-lipped, though, and not long after, Yoon Sup receives a call, and it brings him to the police station with the king. It's here they're shown information about Luna, before turning their attention to Gai Hwan, the man Lee Gon captured and threw in the palace dungeon last episode. Only, it turns out he took his own life, and is registered as dead. That means the man Lee Gon's captured is actually his counterpart from Korea. After finding this out and watching the lanterns starting to fall, Lee Gon races off to the portal as everything freezes around him. Inquiring with the guards, he finds out that Lee Lim hasn't passed through the portal either way, meaning he must be using a different location to jump worlds. At a guess, it seems like he's using the bookstore, but for now, that remains a mystery. Realizing he's missing a crucial part of this puzzle, Lee Gon calls the guards back to the palace, before racing into town, where we catch up with the scenes from the previous episode. Lee Gon comes face to face with the traitor Lee Lim. Before seeing their showdown, we cut back in time, and see more of their conversation on the phone, with Lee Lim challenging him to meet. This catches us up to the present as Lee Lim's followers hold several bystanders up at knife point. Lee Gon tells his men to hold their fire, but Lee Lim's men don't do the same. Yoon Sup spots the bullet, and sacrifices himself to prevent the king from being shot, taking the bullet himself. As Lee Gon controls the situation and calls the guards to care for the injured, Lee Gon tries to awaken Yoon Sup. In the aftermath of the shootout, Li Lim starts to trend on social media, and it brings Ku into thinking the rumors of him being alive are true. As word of this gets round to the coffee shop the prince is visiting, he learns about the king being shot at and races back. Thankfully, Yoon Sup's bulletproof vest prevents there being a more serious injury to him beyond a few bruises. Back at the palace, Ku phones through and speaks to Li Gon about the possibility of Li Lim still being alive. Realizing this could be made out to be a political scandal, Li Gon instead decides to spin the story that this was simply Li Lim's followers conducting an act of terrorism. Given the state of panic gripping the kingdom, Li Gon tells Secretary Mo to call a press conference to quell any concern. In Korea, Jo Young and Tae Yul visit Yoon Jae in prison and ask who gave her the phone. She acts shifty, though, and refuses to meet their gaze. It's enough for the duo to realize they may be onto something. Later that evening, Shin Jae and Tae Yul sit together and discuss Korea, including all the differences there compared to here. As they keep talking, Shin Jae opens up, and we learn more about him, including his intuition that he knew Li Gon's name before he told them, meaning he's starting to understand where he's really from. In the aftermath of this, Tae Yul heads back to the hotel room and greets Jo Young with food. As they discuss Li Lim and traveling back and forth between worlds, Jo Young asks whether she'll be able to handle the worlds being separated forever, and Li Gon moving on and marrying the queen just like tradition expects. It's something she clearly hadn't thought about before, and the revelation certainly gets her thinking. Back in Korea, a blood-stained Li Lim arrives in the palace and confronts the prince. He promises to choke his nephew and take Manpa for himself, but before he goes, he kills the prince and leaves him in a heap on the ground. Secretary Mo returns to the king's chambers and breaks the bad news to him about the prince. While the funeral takes place, we're graced with a hard cut to Korea as we see Li Gon greeting Tae Yul one more time with a bouquet of flowers and saying his goodbyes. Before he goes, he tells her he loves her deeply, something he had difficulty saying earlier in the season. As he walks away from her after their fated kiss, Tae Yul is left with the flowers and falls to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, which is where the episode ends. There's a lot of unanswered questions here, including who the boy with the yo-yo is. I'm wagering a guess that it's Shin Jae and Li Gon's different appearances, but one thing seems almost certain: Li Gon is jumping through time, and we may be experiencing a different Li Gon every time he's jumping through the portal. The red balloon floating away is certainly interesting, perhaps even symbolic to Li Gon letting go of Tae Yul in Korea at the end of the episode. It seems likely that the Li Gon at the end is one that's already time traveled, and it backs up the earlier scenes with OK Nam when he asked whether he made it back in time and what the date was. Much like Netflix's German mindbender Dark, the King, Eternal Monarch feels like a show that's set up for a binge watch. There are so many little hints dotted through the episodes that time travel is involved, the white rabbit being Chaz, the mystery man woman in the throne room, etc., that trying to remember all of this each week is pretty difficult. Thankfully, we're starting to reach the business end of the series now, and it seems likely that everything is going to start slotting into place soon. Some of the subplots have still gone unexplained, Li Lim's motive with the doppelgangers being switched being one of them, but there's enough here to make for an entertaining watch nonetheless. Roll on next week's set of episodes. Following last week's dramatic episode, The King, Eternal Monarch cranks up the tension again as we see more of Li Gon's journey toward understanding the time jumps and what that means for the fate of both Korea and Korea. With a lot more action this time around, and a tight focus on progressing our main plot, we're certainly gearing up toward the final act now, and this is shaping up to be one of the better Korean dramas this year. We begin episode 11 of The King, Eternal Monarch in Korea with the police chasing after Luna. After a truck hits her car, Luna is also struck as she's brought before Li Lim with an intriguing offer. She refuses to work with him, though, until he shows her Tae Yul's ID card and pictures of her doppelganger happy with her parents. He promises to give her a new life and tells her fortune has come knocking at her door, which is persuasion enough to have her jump on board. At the same time, Prince Baeyong's funeral goes ahead, and Li Gon pays his respects along with everyone else. In the aftermath of this, Ku receives another package, and this time she gets a series of photographs featuring Li Lim in every shot, confirming that he's actually alive. Li Gon and OK Nam continue to struggle with the ramifications of Prince Baeyong's death. As we cut across to Tae Yul, we see her reminiscing about Li Gon's kiss and telling her he loves her very much. In the aftermath of this, Tae Yul decides to team up with Shin Jae and look further into the murder case she's been dealing with. As they begin to piece together the clues, Shin Jae asks who Li Lim is. Lee Gon meanwhile speaks to Sung Hien at the palace, and tells him he's not to step foot inside again. The next in line to the throne will be Sejai, and after dropping this bombshell, he speaks to the coroner and finds the ring on Prince Bayoung's finger, which is obviously a taunt given it's the same ring that was back in the throne room during the first episode. As he throws the ring in the air, time stops again, and he realizes Lee Lim has switched worlds. When time unfreezes, Lee Gon finds out from Secretary Mo that Ku has pulled the trigger and released incriminating details to the press. For now, he decides to sit and wait to see exactly where Ku is going with this. Instead, he ponders the security logs and deliberates on the Yosu bookstore and just what Prince Baiyong was doing there. In order to try and get answers, he interrogates the two men he has captured but gets nowhere. As vengeance starts to consume him, he announces publicly that he's going to behead Gai Huan to show he means business. Back in Korea, Shin Jae fights a strange man in the alleyway, and as they duel it out, manages to note down the registration plate just before they get away. At the same time, Taeyul finds Ku's doppelganger and finds out her name is actually Ku Yune unbeknownst to her. Lina happens to be watching from afar, and this may explain the time jump earlier in the episode. As we soon see, she's prepared for this and changes her hair and clothes to switch places with Taeyul. Taeyul collapses in the dojo, and when she awakens, finds herself tied up in Korea in a strange warehouse. Ku arrives in Korea and heads into the familiar cafe, only to be stopped by Jo Young who notices her. As the two lock eyes, Lee Gon starts to decipher the time jumps in his Korean palace, and pieces the seconds together to realize that the time freezing is multiplying by prime numbers. Given the frequency of the time stops, there will come a moment. Lee Gon finds who the owner of the bookstore is and heads there with his men, ready to raid the place. Unfortunately, he kills the owner in his wrath, and as he looks at the body of the man on the floor, he realizes the doppelgangers are switching places and immediately asks for help. The boy holding the yo-yo helps Taeyul, and tells her he's trying to restore balance. He unties her from her binds, and as he does, Taeyul fights her way through, and manages to escape. Only, when Lee Lim finds out what's happened, he slices the informant across the face, and demands she be brought before him dead or alive. While fighting off the guards, Taeyul leaves a message for the king asking for his help given people are after her. Just after leaving the message, a truck plows through the phone booth, leaving her to scramble out the way. Unfortunately, Lee Lim's men close in around her, and all hope looks lost. Thankfully, police rush to the scene first, along with Lee Gon on Maximus. A big skirmish ensues, as Lee Gon fights his way through Lee Lim's men to get to Taeyul. As the episode closes out, Lee Gon throws his arms around Taeyul, and leaves us a theory of Yuji agonizingly groaning at that cliffhanger finish after such an exciting 70 minutes of drama. With lots to digest this time around, it does seem like a lot of the theories from before are starting to come to fruition now. Lee Gon from the end of the previous episode is different to the one we saw this episode, and on top of that, we're seeing a lot more jumps between worlds for characters making things a little more difficult to follow, but also clear that we're gearing up for a big fight ahead, especially after that crazy 5-minute fight in the city. That's before even mentioning Lee Gon shouting for the future Queen of Korea, moments before riding into battle. The one element that holds this back from being a better series, though, is the editing. Rather than changing the hue of the scene slightly between Korea and Korea, we're left with different looking characters, which is fine, until they jump to alternate worlds and make things a lot more complicated. It's not a deal breaker, but it is something that makes this a lot more difficult to follow than it perhaps should be. Still, the second half to this drama has seriously stepped up its game. Following yesterday's shocking episode, The King, Eternal Monarch returns with another shocking episode that drops some serious bombshells and leaves the door wide open for the final set of episodes to come. With the future seemingly bleeding into the present, and time starting to melt away like a Salvador Dali painting, this sci-fi Korean drama has done a wonderful job keeping things consistently exciting throughout. We begin episode 12 of The King, Eternal Monarch with a bloody Jeong Hae told to get some sleep as a man and woman restrain her and prevent her from committing suicide. Sung-ae and Jo Young talk together, and the former realizes there may be a doppelganger given Yoon-sup kept calling her Narai, and acted a little shifty. Yoon-sup tries acting normally around her, but secretly misses his Narai. This is where we catch up with the scenes from the previous episode as Prime Minister Koo arrives in Korea and orders a drink. Jo Young enters soon after and acts like Yoon-sup, buying a drink of his own, and acting indifferent around his Prime Minister. Watching as Koo leaves, he uses Narai's card to race after her. Back in Korea, Lee Gon receives a call confirming that the police are chasing Luna and she caused a big scene. As he starts looking through the camera footage, he reviews the CCTV and sees Taeyul struggling and realizes that they all think she's Luna, which is why the police were after her. At the palace, Nam begins to realize what's happening regarding the doppelgangers. As she leaves her room, she approaches Sean Young and slaps her across the face, demanding to know if she's the real one. Only, she takes the easy option and ingests poison as she bleeds from the mouth and collapses on the ground. On the road, Jo Young confronts Koo, but as she feigns not knowing anything, a black car drives by and shoots him in the shoulder. Koo makes a swift exit though, allowing Shin Jae to patch him up and learn more about his past and the exact time he became the unbreakable sword back at the palace. This catches us up to the events last episode as Taeyul sobs in Lee Gon's arms. The officers disperse as Taeyul passes out from exhaustion and Lee Gon takes her to his chambers. Thanks to the efforts of Dr. Huang, a dehydrated Taeyul is going to recover soon. As she does, Lee Gon makes a big impression by dressing in his navy gear and making food for Taeyul. After getting her clothes to wear afterwards, he stuffs a plum blossom necklace in her pocket. Meanwhile in Korea, Luna eats fried chicken and tries to catch up with Taeyul's life, looking over her pictures and reading the group messages. Just like Jo Young did, Luna takes 21 days vacation from the station, which immediately raises alarm bells for Shin Jae given he's seen this before with Yoon Sub. Speaking of which, Taeyul and the king arrive at the hospital and greet Yoon Sub, holding some roll cake for him as requested. They then turn the conversation on to Narai and he immediately perks up when he learns she doesn't think Jo Young is as handsome as him. We then cut across to Lee Gon and Taeyul talking about the upcoming fight with Lee Lim and how his side of the flute may be hidden in the umbrella. As they walk together, Taeyul tells him she's glad he turned out great. We skipped a lot of things, she goes on to say as he tells Taeyul about his past. As they do, Lee Gon greets the priest and tells him he wants a photo of them together. Just before the camera snaps their picture, time freezes completely, leaving Taeyul smiling and Lee Gon watching them. After weeping for a while, time finally unfreezes and they snap the photo. As lightning crackles across the sky and thunder rumbles, we return to Lee Gon and Taeyul in their room together. He tells her he feels like he's been burned and she sees the scar firsthand. Only, he's not the only one to feel it. Everyone who's jumped to the alternate world also faces that exact same excruciating pain, a side effect to the jumps. Only, Taeyul doesn't feel the same thing. As they keep talking though, Lee Gon takes a chance and kisses her passionately. Meanwhile, Lee Lim bumps into Shin Jae in the middle of the street before heading to his office and watching Luna on the security cameras taking a stash of notes from a safe. At dinner, Lee Lim sits with Jeong Hai, and after some initial awkwardness, she smacks him in the face with a vase and tries to leave. Only, he's too quick and knocks her to the ground, calling her perfect. Prime Minister Koo makes her move after learning some shocking news and enters the palace without permission. She heads up and confronts Lee Gon, who admits that everything in the news is correct. Only, as the lightning crackles, he notices the scars across her chest and notices that she's been jumping across to the other world. As the episode closes out, Nam sits with Taeyul and asks her what happened during the war in June 1950, waiting for her response. Only, that war correlates to the Korean War that engulfed North and South Korea for years. That's not something from Korean history, so that almost certainly confirms she's actually from the Republic of Korea. What a twist. Given the characters have been jumping freely between worlds, there's no denying that the King, Eternal Monarch does have its confusing moments. I've had to rewind this one a few times over the weeks to be sure character is the right version, and even then, it's not always clear. Even a bit of expository text in the bottom right-hand corner to denote Korea or Korea between scenes would be helpful. Failing that, adding a slight hue change between worlds would definitely help distinguish this, especially given the time jumps we're now dealing with too. Thankfully, the hedonistic blue-orange lights that appear during the Taeyul Lee Gon segment partway through the episode at least show that they're in a different time, and Lee Gon's crying during this scene is heartbreaking and incredibly well handled. There's a lot to digest in this one, and hopefully we'll get some answers surrounding just when Nam jumped across into Korea. It seems likely that she may well be the reason the flute is still kept in the royal palace too, but for now, the King, Eternal Monarch bows out with another strong episode, and lots of questions left ready to be answered in the following episodes. The King, Eternal Monarch has been a bit of a slow burn, but boy has its second half of episodes stepped it up a gear. With lots of unraveling pieces still left to be put back together, some of the bigger mysteries of the series are starting to be answered now, including just who was inside the palace all those years ago. While the twist is one that many fans will have seen coming, especially given the sheer amount of clues that have been meticulously picked apart by fans eager for answers, the reveal is still surprising nonetheless, and leaves lots of scope for next week's set of episodes to deliver more of the same. After losing her family, episode 13 of The King. Eternal Monarch begins with Nam revealing that in the past she was approached by a man asking if she'd like to go to a world without war. That man was Lee Gon's grandfather. It's here Taeyul reveals what happened in the Korean War and how, after those 3 years of pain and anguish, the country has remained split and divided ever since. She finishes by offering up a sincere apology. Prime Minister Koo meanwhile struggles to comprehend what Lee Gon is telling her, and she reveals Luna's criminal record, hinting that she may work against him going forward. As lightning crackles, he sees the scar across her neck and understands she's jumped between worlds too. When she leaves, Lee Gon immediately speaks to National Forensics, requesting they look into Gai Huan and see if the marks are the same on his body too. Meanwhile, Koo finds herself face to face with Taeyul in the hallway. After a confrontation, she mentions the Koo building and starts laughing coldly until thunder rumbles once more and she sees Koo's scar for herself. She and Lee Gon decide on their next course of action, which sees Lee Gon speaking to Kim Joo-hyun, the physician, about Gai Huan's scar. It turns out she's seen it before, and that same scar has cropped up in prisons, a place where doppelgangers could cross over and remain hidden without arousing suspicion. Yoon-sup meanwhile manages to help catch another assailant at the hospital, where Lee Gon and his men stand waiting at the doorway. As he's taken away, thunder rumbles prompting Lee Gon to grab his shoulder in pain. Yoon-sup though doesn't appear to have a scar, just like Taeyul, which gets our king thinking about what this means. In the past, Prime Minister Koo visits Lee Lim at his bookshop and confronts him over his true appearance. San guesses he's the real Lee Lim, not his son as he's been calling himself. Dropping the newspaper she's been sent in front of him, he reveals the truth about the parallel world, and she immediately guesses he's going to try and blackmail her. Lim laughs coldly and gritting her teeth. Koo requests to be taken across to the Republic of Korea to prove it's real. This also explains why and how she crossed over. In Korea, Nam feeds back to Lee Gon that a spy has been acting in their midst, and reveals it's Seokjin. With her now conscious, Lee Gon arrives to visit the now conscious spy, and reveals why she did what she did. Lee Lim was the one who blackmailed her, threatening her family, and decided to consume the poison herself, rather than let him suffer that fate. Back in Korea, Luna is dumbfounded in her role as she sits and eats dinner with her father. Of course, this is difficult for her given her own family passed away so young. As she looks over Taeyul's house, she scoffs when she notices the symbol for Gemini. Taeyul hurries to meet Lee Gon on a bridge where she reveals she's about to find Lee Lim's bamboo forest. This may well be the spot he's jumping between worlds. Lee Gon reveals that as soon as that portal opens, time freezes. This time, it's going to freeze for an hour. Realizing that he'd be alone during that time, she throws her arms around him and hugs Lee Gon tightly. As they talk, the conversation turns to the flute, and Lee Gon admits to trying to ride in the dimension between worlds to find the edge, but was unsuccessful in doing. As we cut forward, we see Yoon-sup transferring between the worlds, as Lee Gon says his goodbyes to Taeyul, watching as she crosses back over to Korea. It's worth noting here too that red balloons are floating in the air, so we can ascertain that the moment involving Lee Gon admitting to loving Taeyul happens later in the timeline. When Taeyul returns home she learns Luna has been there, and immediately sets to work trying to work out what's happened. Meanwhile, Jo Young and Shin Jae speak one last time surrounding his lineage and in particular, his mother. On his way out, Shin Jae runs into Luna, but believes she's Taeyul. She kisses him, before running off to take the call from her father. When Shin Jae turns the corner, he runs into the real Taeyul, and immediately realizes her counterpart is running around. She also has Taeyul's ID card too, and after a hostile phone call, Taeyul finds herself struggling to deal with the ramifications of this. Back in Korea, scandalous information about Prime Minister Koo is revealed thanks to the chairman saving the company by throwing his ex-wife under the bus. In the wake of this, Lee Gon reveals to Jo Young about Koo infiltrating the palace. Yoon-sup returns home and hugs Yoon-bae and Na-right tightly, having finally returned to the right world. Lee Gon arrives at Taeyul's house, and she introduces him as her boyfriend. When he tastes the food, he comments on how tasty it is, and compares it to the palace food. Afterward, they exchange gifts, with her buying him a black coat that looks strangely familiar as the same one we saw in the throne room during episode 1. For now, Taeyul continues to look into the murder case, and with Shinjae, they head to a care home that may hold some clues. Not long after, Lee Gon wears the black gear given to him by Taeyul, and checks it out in the mirror, but stops when Taeyul arrives at the door to greet him. Only, our Taeyul is at the care home, so that must mean, this is Luna. As he realizes this too, we cut back in time and finally understand that the one who saved the young child in the palace was Lee Gon himself. Lee Lim also figures this out at the exact same time too. As Lee Gon struggles to catch a breath, he collapses on the ground as it appears as though he's been poisoned. Before we can find out for sure, we cut to the palace in the past for real, where it appears as though this theory holds weight, but with a mask on, it's difficult to know for sure. For now though, the episode ends on another cliffhanger. After 12 episodes, the King, Eternal Monarch is finally starting to answer some of its bigger questions, and seeing this come to fruition now is certainly satisfying. Given the way Lee Gon was watching himself in the mirror, it seems like he's the masked shooter, and given that revelation, we may be looking at a continuous time paradox, where Lee Gon has to save himself, and do all these things, to set the cycle up to repeat itself. It also seems likely now that the aforementioned White Rabbit that we saw run away from Lee Gon back during the opening parts of the series is actually Luna, which explains a lot more about the black clothes she was given. Thank you to those who commented below with this information. This also ties in nicely with the recurring motif of black and white that's been more prominent during these later periods of the drama. The whole idea of yin and yang seems to be playing out here, and it backs up the early ideas around this being a show leaning heavily on the concept of dualism. Alongside that, the series does a great job capturing the feel of both worlds, and while we're not really told which world we're in as we cut back and forth, thankfully a lot of the Korean content is exclusively shot inside the palace to prevent this becoming too confusing. For now though, the King, Eternal Monarch delivers another impressive episode, and leaves the door wide open for next episode too. Quite what direction this one will take next remains to be seen, but one thing's for sure, it's bound to be dramatic. The King, Eternal Monarch returns this week after a single episode last week with a really strong, but also narratively conflicted episode. For a long time it looks like the series was gearing up for a time paradox. What happens in the past has always and will always influence the future, but alas that's not the case given the ending we receive here. Still, there's a lot of neat little Easter eggs that are thrown in and make sense now in the context of what we've seen, and it certainly makes for an enthralling watch. Episode 14 of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Shinjae stepping into the hospital ward and finding his doppelganger lying with a face mask on. However, the nurse tending to him arrives and tells Shinjae that she was told to inform a family member to answer the phone when they arrive. In Korea, Luna poisons the King and tells him she's after the whip, but thankfully Jo Young arrives and manages to tend to him before it's too late. However, Luna slips out before Jo Young can stop her, just as paramedics arrive to rush him to hospital. Given it was Luna who poisoned Lee Gon, Taeyul isn't allowed to go in and visit him. After all, Jo Young can't be certainly she's not Luna. Instead, Taeyul phones Yoon Sup and tells him to ring the minute she returns home. Understanding that this she refers to Taeyul's doppelganger, he hangs up and remains vigilant. Lee Lim meanwhile, charges through the bamboo forest and contemplates just how Lee Gon was able to jump back through time and stop him. On the other side, Lee Gon stands before that very same portal, and the two walk through into the world between worlds. Lee Lim is surrounded by floating photographs on his side, something he's been using to blackmail those to his cause, while Lee Gon has red balloons. They both cross at the same time and hurry over, just as a picture of Taeyul fades from existence, and in its place, a flower blooms in that strange world, just as Lee Gon told her that would never happen. They both jump back 1 hour before Ku, that saw King fall at Lee Lim's blade. Lee Lim sees himself, and tells him he's here to save him. It turns out, this was always destined to happen, and he tasks the past Lee Lim to kill the crown prince, and in doing so, he'll show a shortcut back to whence he came. Lee Lim scoffs though, turning his nose up at the proposition and double-crossing himself, slashing future Lee Lim across the throat and killing him. When he bends down to grab the other half of the flute, it disintegrates in his hands. The incident in the palace continues to play out much like it did before, as Lee Gon races in and kills all the guards. Lee Lim watches in shock as he realizes his older self was correct. They retreat just as they were always supposed to, and Lee Gon drops Taeyul's ID card. On the way out the palace, Lee Gon reveals himself to Oknam and tells her he's following his destiny, just as she always advised. Outside, snow falls to the ground as Li Gan makes quick work of the guards, and continues on to follow the spatters of blood to Sung Heen, who happens to be waiting by the gate. It's here Li Gan realizes this man was the one who helped Li Lim escape to Korea. Back in our present timeline, Taeyul rings the king, but Jo Young picks up the phone, revealing that he's gone. At the same time, Shin Jae heads into prison to talk to his father, unveiling the truth that he was switched with the alternate version of himself at Li Lim's command. Now understanding that he's actually from Korea, Shin Jae finds himself lost and confused over what to do next. Eventually he makes his choice, and decides to rush Hyun Min to the hospital. Meanwhile, Li Gan jumps back through the portal, but finds himself struggling to get back to the present time. In order to get back to his own time period, Li Gan realizes he needs to spend 4 months in the alternate place between worlds. Before he does though, in 1994 he rings through to the police, and reveals that Yoon Ho, Seung Jae, Jae Han and Jeong Hai are in trouble. As he hurries off, Li Gan runs into a 5-year-old Taeyul, and tells her he'll find a way back to her. Back in the present, Taeyul continues to water her plants hopefully, wondering just why they're not blooming. Jaeyoung ran from forensics rings, and reveals something strange she's uncovered, that very same recording from 1994 of the king. They suspect he's the one responsible for the deaths, but given this has changed her memories, Taeyul finally understands why she can remember him from her past. After narrowly escaping a sabotaged building, which blows into a fiery inferno, the police officers scramble to learn what's happening, while Koo rings her mother, and tells her to make sure she mentions she had mackerel when she rings again. When Koo hangs up, she grabs the phone stuffed in the drawer, and starts talking about the flute too, contemplating just what it means. Taeyul meanwhile finds more memories come flooding back, this time on election day 2016, when Li Gan rung her and requested to speak. Instead of giving her an ID card, he puts a hairband on her wrist and tells her that when they meet again, he hopes she'll be friendlier. As Taeyul watches in the phone booth, writing appears as Li Gan writes out a date and time. Wait for me just a little bit, I'm almost there. Li Gan then goes on to meet Jo Young in Korea. At the same time, Luna is jumping through time and runs away in the rabbit costume. She was the one dressed as the white rabbit to the king chased all along and ends up with the card in her hand. Back in the present, Taeyul watches Luna from afar as she adopts her life and hangs out with Narai and Taeyul's father. As they lock eyes, Taeyul sets to work confronting her to Palganger. As they stand face to face in the alleyway, Luna promises to kill her and proceeds to stab Taeyul in the stomach. As she falls to a crumpled heap on the ground, Luna walks away back inside the house, leaving our heroine to tend to her wounds and struggling to call for backup. With time seemingly rewriting itself now, Taeyul meets Li Gan in Korea on Maximus just as before, but this time she hugs the king, who's confused over just how Taeyul seems to know who he is, which is where the episode ends. In essence, the king. Eternal Monarch's latest episode is a drama of 2 halves. The first is almost perfect, showing all those fragments from time we've missed, and managing to add some lovely details to what we've seen over the previous episodes. From Oknam being aware of who Li Gan was, and just why she was interested in him fulfilling his destiny all this time, to Li Gan's various jumps through the portal, these work really well to round out this sci-fi tale. At the same time, the second half of this episode appears to start sliding down a very different path, as Li Gan rewrites history in his bid to desperately get back to Taeyul. The rewriting of memories and messing with different versions of Taeyul is bound to open a can of worms, and it's something that's particularly problematic for a lot of characters here. While Li Lim's ending is poetically ironic and definitely the right way to kill him off, it also begs the question as to why he wasn't prepared for this better if it's always happened. Wouldn't Li Lim be wise to his own arrogance? Even worse though is Li Gan's meddling through time and changing his destiny. We've seen that he was destined to have Taeyul look deeper into his past to set this chain of events off, all of which stemming from her untrustworthy nature when he arrives in Korea. If she knows who he is, wouldn't it change the future? The whole point of her going to Korea originally was so he can prove his theory right about 2 worlds, and without that, or with a wiser Taeyul, it's debatable about how you could even have these 2 versions of Li Gan running around. Still, the soundtrack is on point, and is a romantic tale of 2 lovers caught in different periods of time, the king. Eternal Monarch does an excellent job capturing that, and it makes for quite the enjoyable watch. Despite its time travel issues, this drama continues to deliver the goods, and hopefully we'll receive more conclusive answers in next episodes over what the repercussions are, if any, for Li Gan changing the future. Well, here we are. It's been quite the ride up to the penultimate episode, and there's been a lot of twists and turns along the way. As we approach the final fight, one thing's for certain, not everyone is going to get a happy ending. With time jumps explained, despite a few plot holes still hanging over this one, and lots of drama and bittersweet reunions, the King Eternal Monarch is gearing up for quite the dramatic showdown. Episode 15 of the King Eternal Monarch begins during the altered first meeting with Taeyul as she throws her arms around Lee Gon. As she does, we cut back in time to see Taeyul bleeding out after being stabbed by Luna. Her father calls, but before she can speak too much, she passes out. Meanwhile, Shin-jae teams up with Yoon-sup in tracking down Jeong-hae. Before he can, however, the phone rings and Shin-jae, who's actually Hae In-min, remember, is brought before Lee-lim and told that both mothers rest on his next decision. He's tasked with bringing Lee Gon's whip to him, and as we see in the past, Lee-lim approached Hae In-min's mum and promised her a new life. Clutching a young Hae In-min, she regretfully nods and sets into motion what follows in this story. Back in the not-too-distant past, Lee-lim receives a palm reading from Narai that involves him being stabbed across the neck. Of course, he already has this prophecy as he declares that he himself was involved in this action. Interestingly, his action brings a slight tone of regret in his voice. Yoon-sup then shows up and immediately recognizes Lee-lim, shielding Narai until he leaves. When he does, Yoon-sup hurries out and runs into Luna. Taeyul scrambles up to her house alive and well too, eventually capturing Luna. It's here they learn Luna has cancer and is going to die soon. As they talk together, time freezes and Lee Gon races back to Korea and starts looking for Taeyul. In the station, time unfreezes, which startles Jang Michael and the others. He finally realizes he's made it back to 2020 and finds Taeyul. The two finally hug tightly as tears stream down her face. Lee Gon promises not to leave her, and it's here Taeyul explains what happened in the past. Time did change, but only fractionally. Taeyul went to his world earlier in the timeline, she embraced fate, and what was bound to happen happened anyway. As Lee Gon listens, he realizes there's no way for him to change his fate that easily. Only, fate has changed slightly. Shin-jae has now seemingly been forced to work with Lee-lim, and as Lee Gon jumps back again, Shin-jae tells him he wants his life. However, Jae-hun's mother, the Korean alternate of Lee Gon, walks past and Lee Gon promises to help. "I'm not your mother," she says and walks away. This will almost certainly play a part in the finale. Lee Gon finally realizes what he needs to do and decides to try and rewrite history. Just before he goes, he promises to return to Taeyul in the future. While Taeyul and Lee Gon spend the day together and make the most of what fate has allowed them to have, Jo Young and Yoon-sup say their goodbyes, with the latter begging Jo Young to return to him in the future. It's a teary farewell, and something that's incredibly moving. Meanwhile, Lee-lim meets Koo and tells her she can't become queen. Instead, she decides she wants the flute and will take it from him. He grabs her by the throat and gives her one way out of this to live, bring him to the memorial for Lee Gon's mother. Only, time freezes midway through asking, and Lee-lim realizes that his nephew has now crossed over into. Secretary Mo informs Lee Gon about Seung-hyun, and now understanding his part in all this, stops the man on the road and drops off a bullet, that very same bullet that shot him in the leg. After knocking him down, Lee Gon walks away. Shin-jae also finds himself face to face with his mother, and finally speaks his mind about what transpired in the past. "I want to wake up from this bad dream," he mutters through teary eyes and walks away. It seems Shin-jae has finally made peace with what happened in the past. Afterward, he sits with Lee Gon and they drink together, with Shin-jae thanking him for offering this kindness. Meanwhile, Lee-lim is poisoned by Jeong-hae after she poisons herself, but before the antidote can be administered, time freezes again. This time though, Lee-lim makes a bold decision and heads out with his side of the flute as Lee Gon fast approaches. Although he's transcended death, Lee Gon still finds a way to meet him, but Lee-lim understands what's happened and tells his nephew time won't flow for quite some time thanks to what he's done. Realizing the world has gone wrong thanks to Lee-lim's constant meddling and use of the flute, time suddenly unfreezes just as Shin-jae and Jo Young both team up together and help apprehend Lee-lim, bringing him into custody. Taking the other end of the flute, the trio head to the bamboo forest, where Lee Gon grabs both ends of the flute and heads into the world between worlds. There, he finds himself on a beach and wonders just how far he needs to go. Back in Korea, Lee Gon commands that Si-jin be made the king in his absence, but unfortunately Lee-lim is one step ahead, and a horrific car crash causes massive repercussions for Koo. She realizes what this means and immediately phones through and asks her mother what she ate. When she doesn't reply mackerel, Ku realizes that her actions have caused her real mother to die, and in her wake, the other version has crossed over. Back in Korea, Taeyul confronts Lee Lim and asks him where the flute is. Of course, this scene of her questioning him in the police station is what we saw way back during the very early episodes of the show, and makes more sense in context now. Taeyul frees Luna from her restraints, and tasks her with protecting her father and family in her absence. Allowing Luna this kindness, she grabs the opportunity to adopt this role, while our lead heroine heads to the parking lot and requests the flute from Shinjae. He admits he has feelings for her, but it's not enough to change how she feels about Lee Gon. As Shinjae stands idly looking at the floor, Lee Gon realizes that the choice he's made only leads down one path. He speaks to K-Nam and asks her for a favor, to let him go and change things forever. As the episode closes out, he races through the portal once more, which is where the episode ends. Given what we've seen here, it looks like we're gearing up for a time reset. Lee Gon is going to change destiny, which appears to be saving his alternate self as a way of righting all the wrongs that have been caused across both timelines and worlds. Both Korea and Korea will go back to how they were before all of this happened, and potentially will get a bittersweet ending with Taeyul and Lee Gon never meeting, but both possibly happy in their own worlds. This could all be completely wrong, of course, but that's my theory over how the finale will play out. Feel free to comment below with your theories, though, as we love reading them. Yoon Sup and Jo Young hugging is certainly one of the highlights this episode, and the beautiful way this plays out really hits home what this world has done for both characters. At the same time, Taeyul and Luna come to a mutual understanding, and it looks like Luna may just taste some of that family time she's been craving so much. Given the issues with time jumps last episode, it's good to see the King, Eternal Monarch, go some way to explain the time differences, and while it's not perfect and could easily be picked apart from a number of different angles, it's good enough to make for an enjoyable watch nonetheless. Quite how the finale will play out remains to be. Well, here we are, guys. After 15 episodes of theories, time jumps and shocking twists and turns, it all comes down to this final 75-minute episode. Although some will undoubtedly be left disappointed with the way this one ends, personally the main theme of two people trying to find each other through time and find their place in this world is beautifully realized, and does a great job capturing this. While it looked like the show would go the bittersweet route and end things with time reset, we actually receive a pretty conclusive and satisfying ending for our protagonists. While some of the time jumping and individual moments are needlessly confusing, at least we didn't receive an anticlimactic ending like Memories of the Alhambra. Instead, there's enough here to make for a satisfying journey that's rewarded with a decent ending for most of the characters we've been following over the weeks. The season finale of The King, Eternal Monarch begins with Shinjae slumping against the side of the wall following Taeyul's rejection. He thinks back to all those moments they spent together and struggles to prevent tears welling up. Lee Lim, meanwhile, finds himself caught at gunpoint by Taeyul, who forces him to walk into the portal to Korea. Meanwhile, Jo Young and Lee Gon make it to the Kingdom of Korea in 1994, the night of the treason. Jo Young snaps the neck of the traitorous gatekeeper as Lee Gon tells him he's going to kill Lee Lim. After giving his faithful companion one final order, Lee Gon charges toward the palace with the four-tiger sword. In the portal between worlds, Taeyul keeps Lee Lim held up at gunpoint until Lee Gon has completed his mission and killed past Lee Lim in the throne room, a ploy to prevent all of this from happening. In the throne room, the pivotal moment plays out just as foretold as the glass shatters and Lee Gon enters. Only, this time he enters without a mask and with Jo Young by his side. With both of them together, they charge into the throne room and kill the guards with ease in a slick, orchestrated move. Unfortunately, Jo Young is injured in the process and passes out by the side as guards rush in and tend to the injured young king. As Lee Gon and Taeyul start to change destiny, the fragments of the flute dissolve and fade away. Without Gon's side of the flute, it means he's stuck in Korea, and given Lim's side of it fades too, he's now stuck with Taeyul in the world between worlds. Back in Korea, Shinjae shows his mother that world's version of him, and she breaks down in tears, sobbing and desperate for him to bring the real Shinjae back. Only, as he walks away, she rushes after him and throws her arms around the heartbroken boy, calling him her son. Back in 1994 at the palace, the past Lee Lim is stopped by Gon before he can enter the portal at the bamboo forest. Only, as Lee Lim tells Taeyul in the portal between worlds, if he's actually stopped in the past, then he wouldn't be standing there. Only, we've seen across the previous few episodes that isn't how time works in this show. As flowers start blooming in Taeyul's house, and the balloons shake and move, time unfreezes in that realm and Leolim is hit in the chest with several bullets from Taeyul's gun. The power of the flute has caused this to occur and the chain reaction sees the photos wither and die too. The final act of this sees Lee Gon beheading Leolim as he's killed in cold blood. As soon as this happens, the Yo-Yo child comments that his toy has broken as we shift to several scenes of him as a child and teenager, watching from the wings in both Korea and Korea as the different events over the season have played out while he makes sure the balance is kept intact. With time now rewritten, Lee Gon's scar fades away too, and this means time will flow differently. As we cut to different shared memories between worlds, it all fades away as time is. All those moments Lee Lim interfered with time are undone, including Hai In Min's mum finally turning her life around, Jai Han living, and his uncle still confined to a wheelchair. Seo Hyang stops Luna from stealing money and instead, her mother shows compassion and invites the girl in for food. Taeyul meanwhile, wakes up in Korea during April 25th. Only, she still has her memories intact of Lee Gon and Shinjae. In this world though, neither of those people exist. As she wanders the streets and tries to make sense of what's happening, to add insult to injury a grown Jai Han walks past in his naval outfit, but obviously doesn't recognize her given it's the wrong version of Gon. Meanwhile, Lee Gon jumps through multiple worlds to try and find his version of Taeyul, including visiting one version of her that's drunk and recently married and another reconciling differences with her mum. In the Republic of Korea 2021 Narai phones Taeyul and tells her a man is there looking to sell a horse. That man happens to be Lee Gon. As the two finally embrace after all this time, we learn that Lee Gon went back to save Jo Young before jumping through every doorway in a bid to find her. As the two look at one another, Lee Gon tells her he loves her deeply, and she tells him she loves him too. In Korea 2022 time seems to have course corrected itself. Hai In Min is still alive, and in the police force, while Luna is now working as a police officer. She visits an imprisoned Ku who happens to be the half-sister of Luna. Where Ku's mother took her under her wing as a child, it looks like she may have adopted Luna and straightened her out. Ku bemoans her luck, though and ironically suggests she should have become the prime minister instead. As it turns out, the king and Taeyul have been meeting secretly every weekend away from their current lives, to catch up on missed time, jumping through the portals together to different periods, while being careful not to jump into their counterparts. One of the worlds they visit Lee Gon is actually a tyrant, and they're forced to leave quickly, before anyone recognizes them. After meeting Lee Gon's uncle in another time, Taeyul hopes they end up in the Joseon period, while Lee Gon cheekily shows some leaves and shrugs. You never know, we might end up in that time period, hinting naughtily at prehistoric times which Taeyul certainly doesn't take too kindly. The next time period sees Yoon Sup finally happy, looking suave and dating Narai. Lee Gon calls him the unbreakable sword, and as he walks away, Yoon Sup shakes his head and calls him insane. Midway through jumping between worlds, in Korea Jo Young notices Lee Gon has gone, and is stopped by the royal guard. Lee Gon grabs Taeyul who happens to be with him, and hides his lover under his robe to make sure no one sees her. In his room though, OK Nam arrives prompting Gon to hide Taeyul under the face mask in a hilarious scene. The comedy continues not long, after when Taeyul tries to hide evidence of her being in this world, heading to the camera footage and narrating footage of Jo Young with a clear secret as he passes a note to Seung-ae. As the duo return to their daily lives, Prime Minister Mo makes office as the Prime Minister in Korea, while Taeyul continues to work as an officer in Korea. Time is seemingly saved now, and the duo continue to live their separate, parallel lives, meeting at the weekend and jumping through time periods together. As the scene fades, the duo walk away with fragmented scenes of them holding hands and growing old. If there's one blemish on this series it comes from the slightly hazy rules regarding jumping through time, and how Leolim needed to be killed twice, or 3 times, if you count the previous episode. Beyond this though, the love story that dominates this Korean drama has been really well written, and the way Gon finds Taeyul after all that time is a beautiful way to end their epic journey over the weeks. There's hints of Hotel Del Luna 2 in the manner this plays out, and that reunion between the two, when they finally meet again is certainly heart-wrenching. Unlike the bittersweet, tear-jerking ending to Luna, Eternal Monarch by comparison is pretty uplifting, ending things on a really poetic note. It looks like Taeyul and Lee Gon will live out their lives happily, but to be honest, the possibility of a second season could still show up if the duo mess around with one of the parallel universes or end up stuck there. What would happen if the pair arrive back in Tyrant Lee Gon's world and have to hide from the guards? What if they did end up in the Joseon period, but were outed as enemies of the state? There's lots of possibilities, but to be honest there's enough here to round out a conclusive finish and take to what we've been given in a self-contained 16-episode structure in true K-drama fashion. It won't be for everyone and some will be a little disappointed, but personally the way this finishes offers up the perfect end to this tale. With most of the big plot points explained, it's only small plot holes that are easy to look past in the wake of this tale. The King, Eternal Monarch has been a wonderful Korean drama, and certainly one of the better offerings of year 2020. Shows involving time travel are always tricky to pull off correctly. From plot holes and convoluted lore to stories rife for contrivances and confusion, The King, Eternal Monarch begins with a fair amount of confusion before writing itself and becoming something wholly engrossing and highly enjoyable. Between parallel worlds and the love story anchoring everything together, this hugely popular Korean drama is helped by returning Lee Min-ho, who fronts this sci-fi series, and helps add a lot of charisma. The story itself revolves around two parallel worlds, the Republic of Korea as we know it, and the Kingdom of Korea. In Korea, the king is killed by his uncle, Lee Lim, while his son Lee Gon faces certain death at his hands. Thankfully, a mysterious cloaked figure approaches and saves him from his fate, fighting through the guards and forcing this man to flee. The only remnant left behind is an ID card for a woman named Taeyul. From here, we cut forward in time as we follow a grown Lee Gon, sporting a scar from his uncle's attack, and leading the Kingdom of Korea. When he discovers a portal leading to another world, and two ends of a flute that caused this to happen, what follows is a portal-hopping journey between both worlds, in a bid to save time itself from collapsing. With Lee Lim alive and formulating a plot to change the world, the story soon complicates matters by the inclusion of both versions of the same character from Korea and Korea, sometimes switching sides or meeting their alter selves. All of this builds up to the climactic fight to change destiny, while establishing some time travel lore along the way. Only, this does change and bend to suit the plot more toward the end. Without giving too much away, the ideas presented during the series hint that what happened in the past will always happen, a cyclical series of events that are impossible to change. Only, this isn't the case, and fate does change toward the end, as our characters set out to right the wrongs and change the course of history. Anchoring all of this together is the love story between Taeyul and Lee Gon. The duo begin with a pretty frosty reception and not much chemistry, but as the season progresses, they do grow into their roles and have a lot more affection together. The rare instances of comedy are well implemented, and the series does a good job capturing this during opportune moments. Ultimately, it's the supporting cast that really shine here though, and all the actors do an excellent job portraying two alternate versions of themselves. Woo Do-hwan portrays the cool-headed King's guard Jo-young, and the wacky Yoon-sup wonderfully, and the scenes they share together are excellent. Stylistically, the series does have trouble from time to time distinguishing between the two different worlds, and the editing does the show no favors when deciphering whether we're in Korea or Korea. Thankfully, most of the action does take place within the palace in Korea, so it's not too much of an issue, but it is worth bearing in mind. The soundtrack is decent too, and the different themes capture the emotions felt throughout the series nicely. We've reviewed that separately so won't go into too much detail here. Visually, the show does well to add some light special effects, and some of the dissolving and time freezing are naturally implemented into the show. The King, Eternal Monarch is a wonderful Korean drama that perfectly portrays its love story center stage, while adding enough twists and turns along the way to make for a highly enjoyable watch. As a binge watch however, Eternal Monarch does feel like it may be quite a heavy one to plow through in one go, especially given the 75-minute runtime for each episode. As a show to digest and take your time with, this is well worth watching. It may not be the best K-drama of the year, but it is certainly a challenger for that throne, and definitely a must-watch for 2020.